Do you think you know whether or not you have free will? If you think you have free will, could you be convinced otherwise that maybe your opinions might not be your own? Who pulls the strings in society? Let's find out. Today we have David Charalambous. He is a behavioural expert who is the founder of Reaching People and a partner in the World Council for Health. Today he's here to talk to us about behaviour manipulation. Hi David, how are you today?
Hey Joe, I'm good, thank you. How are you doing?
Good. Thank you for being on the Kiwi rocket.
You're welcome. It's good to be here.
So, let's start. How did you come to create Reaching People? What is it that interests you about human behaviour?
Well, I've been interested in human behavior for pretty much most of my life, but I started studying it over 25 years ago. But Reaching People really was born out of a couple of conversations I had in sort of March 2020 when I realized that people were no longer being sort of rational in conversations. So from all of my training, I was quite used to being able to have rational conversations and then be able to influence people to listen to reason. But all of a sudden, something very strange was going on. People were very emotional, were very amped up, and they were very, very, really highly charged around the narrative. This concerned me. And then I thought, okay, something's happened here. So then we did a real deep dive into behavior once again, and then we started to see the effects on the way that behavioral science is being used to craft narratives and particularly to use emotion to get people to do things. Yeah, so it was very concerning. So we created the project to try and help people talk to those that were not acting quite rational.
That sounds great. So do you cover workshops? Do you cover information? Do you reach out to the media? Is that how you...
Yeah, well, we've done a lot of radio, we've done a lot of podcasts, we do have workshops, we've got plenty of videos that we put out on YouTube and Rumble and documents. So there's three main pillars to it. One of them is how to get people communicating, because we moved away from trying to influence people because we realized if the people doing the influencing had the wrong information, then that would be a problem. So we tried to make it that people could have good communication, and then the truth would likely arise from that position if they were communicating well. And then we looked to show the scientific community, the ones that were pushing against the narrative and were looking at the real data, how they could message much more effectively. And then the third piece was really understanding behavior. And that piece is so key because everything begins to make sense when you understand the deeper aspects of what drives people's behavior.
Absolutely. So 2020, that's the start of the pandemic.
Yes.
When is it that you first noticed messaging from on high about the COVID-19 pandemic? Was there anything that rang alarm bells for you early on?
Oh, yeah. From day one, it was that the reaction didn't match the statistics that we were seeing. So, it really didn't add up. So when you look at, the amount of people that pass away from heart disease and cancer, etc., that messaging is quite slow and tame. And yet all of a sudden the numbers seem to have been quite low. And yet the reaction was very, very high. And the emotional messaging, and then so much of the protocols did not make any sense. And usually when that happens, I'll look across the board to see, those that are trying to speak up and listen to them and what they have to say. And a lot of those professors and doctors that were speaking up at that time made total sense. And that which we were watching in the news made no sense.
I think it's quite interesting that there seemed to be a divide and conquer tactic going on where some people were being censored by various governments and news organisations, and other voices were being elevated. Could you explain how that might work on the psyches of the public?
Yeah, well, what happens is that people tend to really value who is saying something. So if that person has their name trashed, then people generally won't listen to them as much. So understanding propaganda, whoever's getting trashed, it usually makes sense to look at that person and see, right, is it, because a lot of the time they get trashed is when someone's profit's at stake. Yeah. So if somebody comes out and says something that might threaten the sale of a drug, and then they get a lot of propaganda against them, then it's usually a good idea to look into that. And that's what we noticed. The people that were speaking up, they didn't ever attack the ideas as much as they attacked the person. And that's when propaganda's at stake, because it's called poison in the well, which is if you attack the person. I mean, much they did, even Joe Rogan, if you looked at CNN, they ran an article that said a controversial podcaster recommends fringe treatment. And it's like, well, what's controversial about, he has 50 million viewers, and is it really a fringe treatment? So you can really, when you've studied propaganda as much as I have, you ask yourself the question, what is the intention that the writer wants you to understand? And that's when you can really detect a lot of propaganda at play.
What do you think of the terms misinformation and disinformation?
Well, they're very interesting because the technicalities of it is that it's usually they don't want you to know something. Yeah. A lot of the time when Facebook was censoring things, and particularly YouTube would censor something, not because it's false, but because it disagrees with the place that they say that they will look to. For instance, in YouTube, they will take a video down if it dissuades someone from taking a vaccine, regardless of what the truth of the matter is. It doesn't matter. So their terms and conditions are very interesting because they're not based on facts. They're based on sort of what they make as a statement.
In New Zealand, we were discouraged from spending the Christmas holidays with people who weren't vaccinated. We were told not to talk to our neighbours, and we were segregated with vaccine passports where the unvaccinated couldn't get into much of society. Yeah. So from that, what do you think that would do to people's relationships with each other, that they're not actually connecting necessarily the way that they were because they're not allowed to see each other in person?
Yeah, well, it will have a devastating effect. And it will also, you see, with the propaganda was so powerful that intelligent people were saying, even Chomsky came out and said the unvaccinated should be excluded from society. So it's quite interesting how, a large amount of propaganda can actually have that effect on people. And, they were saying that if you don't take it, you're selfish. Now, this is actually, within behavioral science, there's this thing called choice architecture. And what it is that they calculate which decision you have to make. And then they calculate, so say you've got two options, A and B, and they want you to take A. What they're going to do is they're going to make A very easy, and then they're going to put lots of obstacles into B. That makes sense. So you take the pathway they want you to take. So they wanted people to take the vaccine. So basically what they did was anyone that didn't want to take it, they made life very, very difficult. And so when you look at some of the things that really convinced people to take it, one of them was actually going on holiday, because most people's holiday they consider as their freedom. Their 2 or 4 weeks in the year that they get freedom from, work. And then what they did was they didn't allow you to do that unless you did what they wanted you to do. So it was very mapped out, very, very clearly. And what they did was they applied huge amounts of pressure for you to do what they wanted you to do. It was very interesting that people didn't question that at a deeper level, but that generally happens when people act in a very emotional way. They're not thinking logically, they're just reacting. And one of the biggest drivers for people is safety. And in fact, one of the other biggest drivers is guilt. So they ran a massive study before the pandemic, and they found that the best messaging was the one that made people feel guilty for not doing, as a good citizen should. The fact that the statistics, the data never really supported that wasn't as important as people think, because, once you get the herd going a certain way, most people will follow.
I can imagine that. So aside from guilt and emotional things, is there anything like we had Unite to fight COVID-19.
Yeah.
And in that, we had such ubiquitous advertising. In fact, it cost taxpayer a lot of money. It was
Yeah.
on internet everywhere. The Prime Minister used to give 20-minute speeches before giving an announcement. She would tell the public she's going to give an announcement, and then we'd have to wait. And then she would give a big, long speech about what the government had supposedly achieved. And then she'd give an announcement on whether we're going to improve our lockdown and have fewer restrictions or have greater restrictions. What do you think that might do to the public to experience those things, especially if they're locked down and they're not part of society at that time, the way that they were?
Yeah, well, that will apply a lot of pressure to do as they're told as well. So there's a number of main drives that we have as humans. And one of them, the main one is safety. But some of the other ones are approval. So all of this, for instance, I don't know if you guys did it there, but they had it in the UK at 8 p.m. on a Thursday. We'd go out and bang pots and pans. Right. That was a psychological operation, because what happens is you effectively are showing your badge. So what they did early on is all the key workers are heroes. And it became like, if you didn't agree with that, suddenly you supported fascism or whatever it was. You were the horrible person. So then what happens is people seek approval from their peers and from their society, and they don't want to be, outcasts. And of course, that's what a lot of that messaging was doing. If you do as you're told, you're a good citizen. If you don't, particularly in the UK, they said, if you don't, you're killing granny. And even to children, they were saying, would you take a vaccine to save your grandma? So all of this, even though the data didn't support it, it's very persuasive that people do not want to look like they're putting others at risk. So many people just did as they're told because they were so afraid to harm another person. They were so afraid to look like a bad citizen. They use shame, guilt, all of these emotions relentlessly. The fact that the guys in number 10 in the UK literally had a party as they were telling us that it's dangerous tells us really what they knew. Yeah. If all of them are getting together and having a party, then the risk is nowhere near what they're telling us. But it's really in these sort of crises, when the messaging is so advanced and so effective and using so many aspects of propaganda, you literally can get a whole nation acting like crazy people. And that's what so many countries witnessed. And anyone that spoke up and said, hang on a minute, was then called all sorts of names, abused, lose their license, and of course then less people speak up. Makes sense? So it becomes like the emperor's new clothes, that nobody wants to say anything because they're so afraid. And as an example, I remember there was a friend who said she was in a WhatsApp group of all female friends, and there was many of them in there, and one of them turns around one day and says, oh look, I'm not an anti-vaxxer, but I'm having a problem with my menstrual cycle, because the situation was so bizarre that she didn't feel that she could say, oh, there might be a problem with the vaccine. Nobody could mention it. You were so chastised if that happened. But when she mentioned it, so many other people in that WhatsApp group said, yeah, I'm having the same problem. So it's almost that when that wall breaks, when it's now acceptable to talk about the vaccine harms and the problems with it, then you're going to see almost a tsunami of information coming through, which I think is what we're beginning to see now.
Why do you think there are some people who see the evidence and are reconnected with the unvaxxed but still believe in what the government is saying about the vaccines?
Well, a lot of it comes down to what people want to be true. Yeah. So if you take a family doctor, for instance, and he has two options: to believe that there's crazy people talking about vaccine harms, or actually to think that he may have harmed a lot of people. You can understand which one he wants to be true. Yeah, people don't want to think they've harmed another person. People also don't want to think that they've harmed themselves. So a lot of the time, people's beliefs are built on what they want to be true. And of course, the people pushing the agendas understand this. So they create the incentives correctly. They create the propaganda. It's also very hard to tell now. I mean, I interviewed Meryl Nass a few months ago, and she said the fraudulent science is so believable now that you can literally, if you choose any belief that you want, you can find a study to back that up. Yeah, I mean, it's truly crazy now that the studies that are coming out. I mean, there was a study they ran in the UK, which was absolute nonsense. It's probably the worst study of all time, that it said people that wear face masks are more attractive. Now, I mean, it is laughable. It's absolutely laughable. But they ran that study and they put it in the newspaper because people want to believe these things. And, people want to believe they're doing the right thing. People want to be part of the main group. So if the media can convince enough people that everyone's doing a certain thing, you're going to, because that's the thing. The popular thing becomes popular just because it's popular. Makes sense. And that's why they lied about the numbers, in my opinion, so often. They made it look like so many people were taking the vaccine. And then people were putting it on their Facebook, all this virtual signaling, just to really get momentum going. I mean, there's so many things about the propaganda that are really fascinating. And the way the messaging, and particularly when you look across the globe, that the messaging was very similar from country to country.
Yes.
It was very interesting, and it was almost like a playbook was playing out from country to country. There were subtle changes from one country to the next, but it was pretty much based on the behavioral science repertoire of information that they have now to understand what drives us to do certain things. And how they was able to manipulate people. And I think you said it correctly in your opening thing, that people don't think that they can be manipulated.
Yes.
Okay. And as someone that works in that field, in understanding it, I know that I'm vulnerable to manipulation. Okay. So I'm very careful about what I watch. I won't watch the news. If I want to understand what they're pushing, I'll read it, because I understand there's too many things going on the screen that it's very easy to be distracted. Like if you ever watch a very good magician, they can really, the sleight of hand, they can really fool you into believing one thing over another.
So there's something in the visual stimulus that enhances people's suggestibility. Is that what you're saying?
Well, there's something in how much is going on. Okay. So basically, if you read something, there's not a lot going on. You're reading the words and you're in control. But if you're watching a screen, there's so many things going on that it's because the way to think about it is consciousness is actually quite small in that how many things I can think about at any one time. So if anyone reads their phone number out, you'll notice that they chop it up. They won't read 11 numbers in a row. They read in groups of 5 or groups of 3, and that's because consciousness is very limited how much you can take in any one point. And what they've shown is, which is very interesting in the question, is that those programs where they have the tickers down the bottom, I don't know if you've seen them, where they have something float like the scores or whatever, they know that when there's 2 of those on the screen, people's consciousness just kind of goes into a very receptive mode, and it's almost like a light trance. The other thing that they did, particularly during the pandemic, and it was noted in a book called The Choice Factory a number of years before, that if they have information that they wish to convey to the public, but the public may object to it, they say use radio. Because when people are listening to radio, they're usually doing something else. That makes sense. And when you're distracted, you're much more vulnerable to influence, which is, as we touched on, any good magician will distract you over here while they do something over there. So that's what tends to happen, is because they understand this. And what happens is that humans, we're in a false sense of security, that we don't think we can be tricked, even though anyone that's been to a magic show knows they can be tricked. That makes sense?
So it's because they're consciously signing up for the magic show, whereas they may not be expecting it from something that's supposedly objective and fair, like the news.
Exactly. And that's the thing. And when you're not aware, see, once you know that most of the news channels now are just corporate media, you then realize they're trying to sell you something. And if you watch any movie nowadays, and if you're aware, you'll notice that you're trying to be sold something. So if you watch a Bond movie now, you'll see a certain make of watch or a certain type of car, and it will come up time and time again. If you watch a different movie, you'll have that car coming up time and time again, because they know that this product placement is very, very powerful. Now, additional to product placement, and I mean, these companies pay a huge amount of money to have their product placed because they know it's very effective and it does drive sales up because it gives them positive impressions. But they can also install a narrative. And what they do by that is, and it's, in fact, you remember Dirty Dancing, the movie?
Yes.
Yes. Now, most people don't realize that it's openly admitted by the writer that she wrote that movie to make people more tolerant of abortion.
Wow.
Okay. That's why she wrote that movie. But you see, what happens is that these narratives that they wish to install are normally side stories. They're not main. So, for instance, I first heard about this when they did a project in the 80s it was the Harvard Alcohol Project, got together with Hollywood and ABC Studios, and they wrote Designated Driver into the storylines of many TV shows. It was Cheers, Dallas, shows like this. And then people are aware that this is a thing that exists. And of course, you could argue that that's a fairly positive thing to make people more sensible and not to drive with alcohol. But what they've started to do now is any narrative they now write into these TV shows. So in the UK, into a number of the soaps, they've written in a character that is an anti-vaxxer, and then they make that person out to be a negative person, usually low IQ. If you watch Sherlock Holmes, the US version, whenever they talk about a conspiracy theorist, this person is always low IQ, not very healthy, just, not very articulate with the way they speak. So they realize that what's going on is that people are building unconscious associations to these concepts. So when the average member of the public will use one of these concepts, anti-vaxxer or conspiracy theorist, they really don't think where they got their representations from. Yeah, they're not deeply thinking, what does that word mean to me? And they don't realize that that word has probably been conditioned into their mind by the media to manufacture their opinion. Yeah, and it's so subtle. And I've seen this in myself. Sometimes I'll see something and I realize, why do I hold that opinion? And then I realize that I've watched something on it, because the thing is, you can't really decide how you feel about something. So if you watch, for instance, a well-made movie and you think about the hero, you generally feel positive emotions towards the hero, and you'll generally feel negative emotions towards the villain. Okay. The filmmaker or director hasn't told you to feel those emotions. What they've done is they've created scenes in which those emotions get attached to those characters. And of course, that's what the news also does. So if you talk to the average person nowadays, and I won't say whatever opinion it is, but if you look at what people have an opinion on Russia or anything else, you'll generally see a media conditioned response in most people. And whether it's correct or not is for the experts to say on those subjects, but it's very consistent and it's been conditioned. Yeah. And those people, most of them will have no knowledge of the situation whatsoever. Yeah. Particularly around, when you talk to people during the pandemic and you'd say, why are you taking that medical procedure? They'll say to you, oh, I'm following the science. Okay. And it's like, well, have you read any of it? You know what I mean? Have you spoke to a scientist? Have you what? And it's no, because they haven't done that. And there's many conditioned responses, and some people call it predictive programming. And one of the classics is the person that's had 8 or 9 jabs and has caught COVID for the 22nd time. And all to a T, they will say to you, I'm so glad I had the jab, otherwise it would have been so much worse. Okay. Every single one of them, almost word for word, quotes the same thing. They think that's their idea. They don't realize that the media has been, pumping that idea out so often, so long, that the person doesn't realize that their unconscious mind has come up with that in response to what they've witnessed.
So repetition seems to be really important here. Do the words choices themselves matter as well?
Well, repetition is important because what happens is the unconscious mind is monitoring the frequency in which something happens, whether to, take note of it. Because if something's happening a lot, then you need to notice it. There's many other things. Repetition isn't just enough, but repetition is like walking say you come to a field and there's 2-foot high grass, okay, and you want to cross the field. If somebody's already walked a pathway, that's the pathway you're going to go. That makes sense. And that's what repetition does. Repetition lays a pathway. It almost lays the tracks from which the train will go down. And that's what's happening in so much of what we call the classical conditioning of opinions, is that when it's repeated often enough, I mean, even Oasis, the band, said, if you tell everyone you're the best band in the world, people will start to believe you. And that's what happens. It's repetition. And in fact, what's really interesting is if something's said enough, like safe and effective, I mean, if you say safe and effective 1,000 times, that shouldn't make it more safe and effective. Okay. How many times you say that's irrelevant. Whether it's actually safe and effective is the key point, and that's based on the science. But when it comes to the mind, the more it's said, it almost becomes a truth. Yeah, or certainly a truth in the person's mind.
That is scary, to be honest. And people wouldn't
It is.
be aware of how often they've heard something either. They don't keep count.
No, they don't. And this is why I think what happens is when you speak to people that are aware and know what's going on, generally most of those people do not watch TV.
Yeah.
TV is one of the most damaging things to the psyche. You know, if it was, advice would be just to switch it off.
I see that there's hate speech laws and hate speech concerns around. In New Zealand, they were going to introduce hate speech laws, but the government minister, after they changed governments, decided that that would compromise free speech. But the New Zealand police has been given training on recognising hate speech in things like social media. And they had examples about what would constitute hate speech, like there's only two sexes, for instance, a man and a woman, and a whole raft of other beliefs, specific political beliefs. And I'm just wondering, I noticed that the UK was like that in the beginning, with non-crime crimes. The police would go around and visit people over social media posts, even retweeting.
Yeah.
Do you think things have escalated since then in the UK?
I think they are, and I think they continue to, and they're trying to get these bills through. And you see, you don't even need to enforce a law half the time for it to be effective. You just need people to be wary of it. So by making a few people prime example and then putting that on the news, that will be a deterrent enough from people speaking their mind. And I mean, self-censoring is a really big problem. And when I spoke at the conferences in New Zealand, it was one of the things I mentioned is that so much of the propaganda is to get people to be quiet and do as they're told. And self-censoring is one of the easiest ways that will happen. And how many people self-censored during the pandemic when they spoke up a few times and they got shot down by friends and they didn't want to lose more friends and family. So a lot of people just stayed quiet. And this is, of course, the problem, because I think a lot of people in a few years' time are going to say, oh, why didn't you say something? And quite frankly, a lot of people did, but they didn't listen. So, yeah, those laws are very problematic. And, it's so alarming that people really think that their own government often is the good guy when it should be judged on its actions. And the fact that our Prime Minister, and I'm reluctant to even call him that, says one thing and does another consistently should be very alarming to people. But the problem is that people are under so much pressure just to survive and get enough money to feed them and their family that becomes their priority, and they don't realize what's going on in the background, which is bit by bit these laws coming in. I mean, the fact that some of the things that you can get in trouble for now, anyone 10 years ago would just laugh at. It's some of the narratives are so ludicrous and so far away from reality and science that it begs belief.
Yeah, I see that there's been a lot of riots in the UK. It seems very concerning. Things seem to be escalating to the point of violence. Do you think that's a fair comment?
Well, I think what happens is with a rioting is that whatever the media wants to spin as the story, that will be the story. So any one day there'll be, X amount of trouble anywhere around the world. And when that's focused on, that's what becomes the problem. Now, the people that understand behavioral science very understand the principles that there's this thing called the frustration hypothesis. Now, once people get frustrated and that continues and continues and continues without any release, At some point, they're going to explode. So they did these studies in a hospital where they had people, they've got cameras in there, and they found that there would be a certain number of assaults or people going crazy after a certain amount of hours. And they thought, oh, it must be the alcoholics and the drug people, etc. But it wasn't. It was average member of the public that become so frustrated that they snapped. Now, what they found was that if they didn't leave those people with no information for hours and they gave them an update every half hour, that person wouldn't reach the point of being violent because they knew what was going on. Because one of the things is people feel powerless and they hate not knowing information. So on the underground, for instance, in the UK, we have boards up that tell you when the train's coming. People would rather wait 8 minutes knowing it's coming in 8 minutes than 4 minutes and not knowing when it's going to come. That uncertainty is very problematic. So, they know that the public's going to have certain emotions. And, and Starmer stoked it a number of times with the things that he said. And if that frustration builds and builds and builds, at some point, somebody's going to snap. And that's what happened. And there was a very tragic event that happened. And people felt powerless what was going on in their country because of the immigration policies, all the other policies, is that it's becoming very problematic. And it was inevitable that people would snap, And I'm not saying it's the right thing, but it's understanding what will happen to the general public under certain conditions, and that can be predicted.
Some mainstream media seems reluctant to start reporting on vaccine injuries now, that the COVID-19 vaccines may be causing injury. And I suspect that's partly because the media has been surveying why they've become so unpopular, and now they're starting to take back some middle ground. But do you think that society is anywhere near coming back to a more moderate position, or do you think that people in general are still very divided and polarized at the moment?
I mean, the problem is that any corporate media is serving its corporate masters.
Okay.
And if that news story doesn't push any agenda or serve any purpose, then it generally won't make it to the light of day. Every now and then they have to report on something, otherwise it gets so ludicrous, the fact that they haven't reported on it. I mean, just look at the marches that went on. The one in Australia was something like 1 million people there. The one in the UK, we had millions of people going to London. And then the BBC reported, thousands of people. Okay, so they're clearly lying, and they're lying because it's an agenda. And what happens is that we did a freedom of information request during the pandemic. And what we received was from Ofcom was the guidelines about what TV, what the makers of TV shows could do and say, particularly the news. And it was stated in that they couldn't say anything that dissuade someone from taking the vaccines. So the guidelines become very powerful because the people don't want to break the guidelines because they get fines and they get shut down, etc. So they're effectively guiding what goes onto the TV via the guidelines. Yeah, so the shows won't make it on. And, a lot of the news channels and the corporate media don't want to upset the people that spend money on advertising. And that's the biggest spenders are pharmaceutical companies. But during the pandemic in the UK, the biggest spender was the government. So if you think that the government is now the media's biggest client, is the media going to want to bite the hand that feeds them? Okay. And you saw that the media all through the pandemic hardly said a bad word about the government, when historically that's most of the juicy stuff that the media can print.
In your opinion, do you think people were in a trance, or do you think they were just deceived during the pandemic?
Both, basically.
Okay.
So there's what we believe has a major effect on our behavior. So if somebody believed that the sun was bad for them, they wouldn't go out in the sun. If another person thought the sun was lots of vitamin D and healthy, they'd go out in the sun. So making someone believe something becomes very powerful. I mean, look at the food, for instance. They convinced everyone that butter and steak and all these things were unhealthy, regardless of the statistics or the fact that for thousands of years we consumed those were no problem. But the minute they convinced people that they were unhealthy, people changed their behavior significantly. Okay. And this is where they have a massive effect. So they get people to believe certain things, and then people change their behavior. And then, when it comes to people being in a trance, I think a lot of people, particularly when they're scared, will generally go into a bit of an altered state.
Oh, that's interesting. Is that because their executive functions shut down a bit out of the fear?
Yeah. So basically, when you get emotional, the rational mind literally shuts down.
Yeah.
And it's really I mean, this is what's fascinating about it. The process itself is a functional process. So your blood goes to your arms and legs, enable you to run or fight or flight, etc. What happens is a lot of people actually freeze. So they literally don't know what to do. And then there's this fourth one, which is fawn, where people just give in and just follow orders easily. And that's what happens. Fear is a very, very powerful emotion, and it's really the currency of control. So it literally paralyzes people to the fact that they won't do anything. And then what happens is that hope will drive behavior. So if you notice during the pandemic, it was you mustn't do anything, you mustn't go in everything, literally the world stops. And then they say the world's going to start again if you do what we tell you to do. And they also used a very hypnotic command, which was they said the only way out. They kept saying the vaccine is the only way out, which effectively is saying your only way out of this prison is to take this jab. And people started using that. So that's a very powerful thing. But you're right in that when people are very emotional, that the part of the mind that's that rational part of the mind is the prefrontal cortex, and that will shut down. Literally. And I know when I've worked with sports people and poker players that it's very important for that not to shut down, because that's very important in choice making.
Well, I can almost see that when people are kind of locked down at home and they can't make choices, and then the government's telling them what to do, it would be easier to take the path of least resistance and just obey because someone else has taken that burden off you.
Yeah, and they were very explicit by saying, this is too complex for you to understand. You need to trust the experts. Here's the approved experts. Follow them. Now, there is a wisdom in trusting experts. Like, I needed the brakes done on my car this week, so I took it into a place that's an expert in putting brakes on, and he did that. That makes perfect sense. If, however, I didn't trust that he was going to do it fairly, then we've got a problem. Lucky enough, the gentleman that did fix my brakes is a friend, but when it comes to this is the thing, it's that cui bono, which is the Latin for who benefits, is that the propaganda was so advanced and it was so relentless that people could be forgiven for falling for it. But the fact is, it was so built on a house of cards that it didn't add up. You only had to push it. But the problem is, if you were a business and you needed to open up, they went after all the pressure points in people. Yeah, so they're saying, look, you can't get to see your family again unless you do this. The amount of people that I heard of where their family wouldn't let them see the kids or whatever unless they had the jab, etc., etc. That applies a lot of pressure. And of course, if people weren't aware of the potential danger of taking that, so I would say that probably a lot of people would assume that it's some kind of medical procedure like taking a few aspirin or something like that. And they think, oh, I'm just going to do it to be able to do what I want to do. But when you looked into it, it was far more risky than that. And that's the thing. And I mean, it's like a magic trick. Once you see it, you don't fall for it anymore. But if you haven't yet seen it, it can be quite persuasive.
Definitely. I've noticed that with climate change, there seems to be a similar thing going on.
That one's very problematic because they've got so many people saying the same thing at the moment. Yeah. And I've looked into it. I've noticed there's the same thing, that anyone that's saying anything against it is censored. So then the illusion of consensus is very, very powerful. If it looks like all the brainy people, all the scientists are saying one thing, then you could be forgiven for thinking that must be true. The problem is that you really, and it was Karl Popov, philosopher of science, that said this, the ones that disagree with the theory are far more important than the ones that agree with it. Okay. So anyone that disagrees with it, you want to listen to their perspective and see if there's any valid points in there. And when it came to the vaccines, the lockdowns, all of those things, it just seemed to me, when you were listening to those people speaking up, that they made sense. Okay. And when we look at the climate change, I mean, I've been on a few radio shows where even the broadcaster knew the basics of science, that what they're telling us can't possibly be true. It doesn't fit, a true scientific way of looking at the problem.
I find it interesting that they used Greta instead of a scientist. They used a young girl, a disabled girl, allegedly. And yeah, I find that an interesting figurehead that they chose to get young people to follow.
Yeah, but it's like a boy band, isn't it? They're choosing the things that resonate with people. I mean, they know the studies around this, that when it comes to who we elect, we generally elect the better looking people. It's, they can really predict all these things, and it's also whether someone comes across well in the way that they articulate. And this is what you'll see. The politicians are trained up in how to present, how to speak. They generally have a certain look to them, a certain cheekbones, all of these things, what color tie they have, how their shoes look, all of these things. It's not that that's how they are. They're presented that way. Okay. And of course, when it comes to the climate change, should we listen to a 15-year-old girl, or should we actually listen to the climate scientists? And any climate scientist that spoke up and said, hang on a minute, this isn't the case, they lost all their funding. And if people can't literally feed their family unless they do as they're told, you're going to see a lot of people do as they're told.
We have a COVID-19 inquiry into the previous government's handling of it next month in New Zealand. And I do wonder what things should be looked at and how they should be looked at, because you can have an inquiry or an inquiry.
Yeah, most of the inquiries are basically just make people think that it's been looked into. Yeah. I mean, not many inquiries really do the dirty digging and come up with the conclusions. Most inquiries will just say that mistakes were made, but people generally did well, is what they come up with. So that's not controversial. Yeah, so I'm intrigued what happens in the New Zealand one, because a lot of these inquiries into the pandemic should be hugely controversial in the sense that, people were not following solid science. Okay. I mean, there's so many experts that would tell you that. Experts in health and safety, experts in masks, experts in all these things will tell you that the policies did not follow what was known scientifically. I mean, even the social distancing, that was just plucked out the air. That had no science behind it whatsoever. But you'll notice that all of these things were putting people into such uncomfortable positions that when it come to, okay, all you have to do now is go and take this jab and you get your life back, and then obviously, the numbers, how they got away with telling people 95% effective when it's like 1%, it's truly incredible. People didn't understand what they were being told. So the inquiry should really dig up a lot, but it really does, depend on who's doing it and what, scope they have.
What do you think people should do to safeguard themselves against propaganda?
Well, the thing is not to watch the TV. I mean, to know who's telling you what they're telling you, and do they have anything to gain from telling you what they're telling you? I mean, I generally, for me, if it's a choice to listen to a TV doctor that's getting paid to say that, or to listen to a doctor that's literally lost his career because he's saying that, then I know which one I'm going to want to trust more. It's the one, if someone benefits from telling you what they're telling you, it's like a salesman. I mean, even Jimmy Dore pointed this out. And he joked that during the pandemic, you were shamed if you did your own research, which he said was basically just reading. He said it's like going to the car salesman and someone saying, oh no, just trust the car salesman. It's like, well, no, I'm not going to trust the car salesman. So how would you protect yourself from propaganda? I think what's useful is to understand the types of propaganda. So we're actually just about to release a document in a few weeks, and it's called 50 Shades of Propaganda, and it's basically listing all those different types of propaganda. So once you know them and you spot them like a magic trick, that's good. So what I would say to people is familiarize themselves with that. We've got lots of videos on our website advising people that. We've also got an A to Z of influence, showing people all the different types of influence. For instance, I know that one of the main types of influence is called the authority principle, which is they're going to get an expert to tell you something, and therefore you're going to trust that more because that expert's told you that. Whenever I hear that, I find other experts that are saying the opposite. Then the expert says, who's funding each of these people? That makes sense. So to protect yourself from propaganda, watch as little TV as possible. Be very skeptical when you read the news. Look for, particularly nowadays, look for independent journalism, people that are doing it because they want to do it, because the mainstream journalism now is very problematic. In fact, there's a really good book called called Slanted by Cheryl Atkinson, and she does a great job in showing how the media slants stories with propaganda.
Wow, that sounds fantastic.
Yeah, it's a great book.
Thank you very much for being on the Kiwi Rocket and giving your time today. This has been a very fascinating look into the world of propaganda and manipulation.
You are welcome. It's good to talk to you, Joe.
Thank you.